Until this point, we have been looking at the behavior of an individual largely as a cognitive process in which an individual perceives an environmental stimulus, interprets the stimulus, and responds accordingly. We have seen how the social networks with which one interacts, as well as the social and cultural context in which one grows up and in which one now lives, can affect both an individual's interpretation of an external stimulus as well as the resulting response. At this point, I would like us also to consider how the presence or absence of others around us might affect us as we make these cognitive assessments and determine how we should act or not act, as the case may be, in response. Specifically, I would like to ask that you consider how our immediate social group, and in particular the size of that group, might affect our behavior. What we will discover in doing this is that in some contexts, more is actually sometimes less. Consider the situation in which you are walking down the street and you witness someone walking nearby. All of a sudden, you see that person needs help. Perhaps she has fallen down and broken her leg. Perhaps she is having an epileptic seizure. In considering how you might respond, I'd like to ask you how this image differs from this image. Rather than you being the only person close by when the person needs help, how might the presence of a large crowd of people who are also witnesses to the emergency affect how you individually will respond to the emergency? Would your response be the same in both settings? In the individual setting shown here, let's say that this is you and this is the person who has the emergency. While in the crowd, this is you and this is the person who has the emergency. Would you respond the same in both settings? In 1964, this question was brought to the public's attention nationally due to a tragic death that took place in New York City. In March of 1964, a front-page article in the New York Times described how Kitty Genovese, a 28-year-old woman walking home from work at night, was raped and murdered on the sidewalk on her way to her apartment. The murderer had apparently selected her at random and beat her and stabbed her repeatedly right there on the sidewalk. The New York Times reported that while this was happening, 38 of her neighbors heard her screams and watched out their window, yet did nothing. Subsequent investigations have raised questions as to how many people had actually witnessed the crime as it was happening. As it was reported at the time, 38 people, any one of which could have called the police or come to Kitty's help, watched as the murder was happening and did nothing. In April 2016, the New York Times reported, "In death, Kitty Genovese has cast a long shadow over America's psyche, far more than she probably would have had her life not been brutally cut short at age 28. Across the decades since her murder in 1964, she has endured as a symbol of urban disconnection and apathy, a victim not only of a knife-wielding killer, but of bystanders' unwillingness to get involved in resisting evil." This is a picture of the neighborhood Kitty lived in at the time of her murder. As we look back on that tragedy more than 50 years later, we ask ourselves, why did so many people watch her being attacked but not do anything? Is the likelihood that a person will intervene in a potential emergency reduced by the awareness that others are also witnessing that emergency? This is the question psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley attempted to answer, largely in response to the reported failure of the bystanders to intervene to help Kitty Genovese. They conducted a series of experiments to test whether this bystander effect could be shown to exist in other contexts. Using university students as their test subjects, they set up a situation in which a subject would be involved in a seemingly unrelated activity when they would be exposed to one of the following situations. A tape recording was played indicating that a person in another room with whom the subject had previously been speaking was apparently having an epileptic seizure and was making sounds that sounded as though they were having difficulty breathing. The researchers in this case varied the number of other students in the same room as the student who was the research subject, but they had instructed the other students specifically to do nothing when they heard the sounds of the other person having the seizure. Even though it was clear that someone needed help, the more other people also hearing the sounds, the less likely the individual research subject would report the need for help. In a second similar experiment, the study subject was asked to wait in a room until they were called to another room to fill out a survey form. While they were waiting, smoke started to billow into the room in which the subject was sitting, suggesting that a fire was burning in the building. Once again, the researchers varied the number of other people in the room, all of whom were instructed to remain silent. Once again, the researchers found that the more other people in the room, the longer it took for the one person to report the smoke. From these results, Latané and Darley described what they referred to as the bystander effect. They summarized their research in the following terms. Quote, when only one bystander is present in an emergency, if help is to come, it must come from him. However, when there are several other observers present, the pressures to intervene do not focus on any one of the observers. Instead, the responsibility for intervention is shared among all the onlookers and is not unique to any one. The more bystanders who are present, the less likely any one bystander would be to intervene and provide aid. Thus, as we have come to understand the bystander effect, the presence of other bystanders who could take action seems to inhibit any one person's sense of responsibility, with and also the resulting willingness to offer help when it is needed. Instead of responding to an emergency, let us instead consider the situation in which an individual participates in a competition against others, either individually or as a member of a team. Will the size of the team affect the intensity of the competitive effort one person makes? Consider the situation of a tug-of-war in which people pull competitively on a large rope, hoping to pull the other team towards them. In which of the following situations will an individual competitor pull the hardest on the rope? When they are the only one pulling? When they are pulling as part of a two-person team? Or when they are pulling as part of a four-person team? This situation is often referred to as the Ringelmann effect, named after French scholar Max Ringelmann. In 1913, Ringelmann had hooked a large rope to a strain gauge and then asked a group of men to pull as hard as they could on the rope, first alone and then as part of a group. He found that each subject would pull hardest when he was the only puller. As the group of pullers got successively larger, the average force exerted individually by each worker decreased. In 1974, Ingham repeated this rope pulling study using teams of various sizes pulling against a strain gauge rather than another team. As Ingham concluded from his study, quote, the present results then tend to confirm the generality of the Ringelmann phenomenon. Increases in group size are inversely related to individual performance, unquote. The more people on the team, it seems, the less effort each individual member will exert. Bibb Latané, the same person who did the bystander effect research we recently looked at, was able to confirm this effect in his own research. In one study, he had college students clap or cheer as loud as they could, first alone and then as part of a group, and measured the average output volume per student. In each case, students clapped or cheered louder as an individual than they did when they were a member of a group. Latané was able to reproduce this effect in a variety of circumstances and applied a name to the effect, social loafing. As Latané described in 1979, quote, whether the subject is dividing up the amount of work he thinks he should be performed or whether he is dividing up the amount of rewards he expects to earn with his work, he should work less hard in groups. In 1993, Corral and Williams reported on their review of 78 different studies involving social loafing and found consistent evidence of its existence across tasks and groups. They also were able to identify 2 additional outcomes from their review. Consistent with the interdependent-independent cultural differences described by Marcus and Connor, Corral and Williams found that, quote, both women and individuals in Eastern cultures are less likely to engage in social loafing, presumably because they have more group-oriented priorities than do men and individuals in Western cultures, unquote. For example, studies comparing Japanese university students with American university students confirmed that the American students would demonstrate social loafing when their task output was being measured at the level of the group as compared to the level of the individual, while the Japanese students would work harder when their task output was measured at the level of the group rather than the individual. Based on these and other similar studies, Latané has proposed a more general theory of the social impact of groups. Now commonly referred to as social impact theory, as Latané reported in 1981, in a variety of circumstances, the presence of others will affect an individual's behavioral motivation by affecting both subjective feelings and cognitive understanding. This effect occurs not only when the others were strangers and the behavior was a need to offer help or assistance, but would also occur when the others were known to the individual and the group was working collaboratively on an assigned task. Thus, we now understand that an individual's behavioral responses to a given stimulus from the environment is not always determined by characteristics of the individual, but often is profoundly affected by the social group context in which the stimulus occurs.